Welcome to the Millennials and Community Podcast. Have you ever known you needed to walk away from something but just didn't know how? Join Matt and Carlo as they explore the whys and hows of walking away, when is the right time, and how leaving something behind can help both you and it grow bigger and better than ever. Thank you for being part of our community.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Millennials and Community Podcast. As always, this is Carlo, I'm Matt, and we're really thrilled to be here with you for yet another, what we hope is going to be, exciting episode. To kick us off, as always, a little bit of an icebreaker just to get us going. So, Carlo, tell us about a time where you had to give up something, maybe from your youth or from earlier in your life that was a really big part of your life.
It's a bit of a tough one for me. I don't linger on that kind of stuff very often. I guess if I had to pick one, I would say airsoft. I played a lot of airsoft as a teenager. Yeah, late teens, early 20s. And I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And there's no particular reason that I had to give it up other than life got busy. And, you know, it's one of those sports that you have to make a very active decision to go, I'm going to go spend the day doing this. It can't really be a couple hours. There's a couple indoor airsoft fields, or at least one. It's like the north of the city, though. So it's a commitment. And I had to kind of walk away from it. I still have my airsoft rifles, though. They are displayed above my computer. I like them. They're cool. Very cool. Yeah.
For me, I think the most prevalent one was when I had to give up football. And I played football from the time I was in grade 8 all the way into university. Played a couple years. Well, played is probably a strong word. I was on the team for a few years when I was in college at the University of Calgary. 2 years on the practice roster, and it got to the point where I had to make the really intentional decision that I never intended to play professional, ever really had an interest in playing professional. And, you know, your career has to end somewhere. And I was experiencing enough injuries and had a couple of concussions and things like that. And so it was time to walk away from the game. But it's tricky when something like that was such a big part of my identity for so long, changes. It feels like, you know, you worry that there's going to be a really big shift in either your identity or the way that people perceive you, because this thing that anchors who you are as a human, so we perceive, is no longer there. And so I remember that. I remember specifically the conversation telling my grandpa, and I had really worked up in my head about how challenging it was going to be, that somehow I was going to be letting down my grandfather by like not playing football. This is something that him and I have always had in common. We'd go to football games together. He played university football back in his day. And I just felt like I was really letting him down when I had to have that conversation. Did he care? Of course not. Was he happy that I was making a decision to kind of support the next stage of my life? Of course he was. And so I had it like built into my head that this was going to be a big, scary thing. It really wasn't. And I'm to this day so grateful that I got to leave the game on my terms, because about 3 weeks after I decided to quit playing football, I broke my back and would have had to quit anyway. So at least I got to make the decision on my terms. And so, you know, I think that's really what today's episode is all about, is like knowing when to actually like give things up, knowing when to let go,
when to hold them and when to fold them.
Exactly. When to walk away. And it's just like one of these things where there's so much mental gymnastics that goes into when is the right time to walk away from something, that it can be a really challenging thing to process.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, this topic for this episode kind of came up through, again, some off-camera chats. And I think it's really important to kind of explore this, whether there is something in your life right now that you are contemplating maybe giving up, or maybe there's just this idea of like, hey, I need to be able to do that should it be necessary at some point. I think it's a really important thing to kind of explore, because to have that capability available to you makes it a little bit easier, because walking away from stuff, especially things that you care a lot about, is a very difficult thing to do, right?
It absolutely is a difficult thing, and it's something that we have to do for a number of reasons, right? We don't always let go of things because they're bad or good, but then we, it's like the classic Batman line, right? You die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And we all have either experienced ourselves or seen people that have stayed in jobs too long, stayed in relationships too long, and not. We always think that had they have left certain situations sooner, that maybe the end wouldn't have been as ugly as it could have been. Again, job, relationship, friendship, whatever the circumstance. So, I don't know that this is one where we necessarily have all the answers, but we want to talk about it. I mean, there's lots of things here. There's the idea of sunk costs, which we'll get into. There's the idea of trying to preserve legacies, which we'll get into. There's just so much that goes into to really understanding what to do and how to make the right decision at the right point in time. Mm-hmm. So, how do you think about transitions? How do you think about the idea of letting go?
Well, to just echo it, it's very difficult. No matter what kind of the reasoning or the stage or the whatever, to walk away from something is just flipping hard. But I think it's necessary for growth, right? There's that old saying that someone closes a door, or you close a door and someone opens a window, kind of thing. I think one of the things that you need to kind of acknowledge is that it is not always clear cut that this is what needs to be done, right? So you think about, let's take the idea of a bad relationship. When it's a bad relationship, everybody else in the world can see that you need to walk away from it, except for you, right? And that can be a difficult thing on both sides, because the people that care about you want to come and say, hey, it's time for you to walk away from this, but they also don't want to hurt you, and they don't want to drive you to some sort of thing that you're not ready for. And then other times it's completely you don't see any reason why you should be walking away from this. It's not obvious to you that this needs to be done until you start to think of what would happen if you did, right? And those are the kind of things that are maybe a little bit more focused career-wise. Maybe you're at a job and you have lost that ability to continue growing, right? You don't have the ability to increase your skill set, increase your salary, any of that kind of stuff. And you have to kind of say, well, I'm not dying if I stay here, but if I leave, it'll open me up for other opportunity, maybe some more money, something along those lines. So there can be a lot of scenarios where this is a necessity. And I think that part of this episode is going to be an encouragement to take stock of your life. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was that as part of your New Year resolutions, you should be sitting down and taking a look at the past year and kind of figuring out what worked, what didn't, what served you, what didn't. And if you did that regularly enough, I don't think walking away would be as difficult as it is, because you kind of notice it as being a regular part of life, right? So one of the things that I think you would have to look at, let's take a look at an athlete as an example, right? If you're in the top of your game and something like breaking your back, which I always forget happened to you, but geez, breaking your back happens and you have to make that choice to walk away. How do you reconcile something like that? What do you think goes through that guy's head?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard because, sports psychology is obviously a significant field, and sports psychologists have jobs for a reason. Sports becomes such a integral part of the identity for people that are high-level athletes that they really, really struggle with the idea of what they would be without it. It's funny because with athletes, there's just so much of themselves that's tied up in it, and their whole work ethic and their whole yeah, I said identity a few times, but it really is all about that game and that one structure. And it's so hard to imagine for a lot of people what they would be without that thing.
Yeah.
But for me, I think that the reason why I think the athlete one is a good one is it is a really good metaphor of how do I assess where in the curve of success I want to be. There's one of two examples I think that I kind of want to go into as far as when to let go. And, presumably if we do something long enough, we're going to reach a stage where we've achieved mastery of a thing. We're really, really good at it. But arguably, the only way we know that we've reached mastery is if we start coming down the other side of the curve, and for whatever reason, we start deteriorating, whether, in an athletic standpoint, typically it's just like age or deterioration of your physical capacity. It may be cognitive ability, who knows what it is, depending on the circumstance. There's going to be something that starts declining. And that's really the only way you know that you've achieved your peak, is when the peak's passed, right? You can't, by definition, see the peak if you're still presumably climbing. And so it can be a really challenging thing. So do we let go of something when we're at the absolute best? Or do we recognize that maybe we're in decline and we want to let it go? Is this something that we want to continue to hold on to all the way until we reach the bottom of the curve on the other side? Like, how do you think about that? When it's something that you're really, really exceptional at, but you know that it's not going to be around forever, how do you in your brain navigate trying to let go of something, maybe in the context of like preserving your legacy? Maybe I'll ask it to you that way, because I think something that I worry about is like, if I'm doing something long enough that I become bitter or not good, really come down the other side of the curve, does it impact the legacy that I have had doing a thing if I let myself drift too far from my peak before?
So like you're talking like quit while you're ahead kind of idea.
Yes.
I think it really depends on what it is, right? So like if we were to look at that in the context of a skill set, right? So you've done this thing for so long, you've become so good at it. There's no way that you're going to move up from here. Is it making you money? Do you enjoy it? Right? Is the potential decline of your skill set here going to hurt someone, whether it be yourself or, somebody buying something from you or anything like that? Because if it's not going to negatively impact you as you watch that decline, I think it's arguable that you could kind of stick with it, especially if you still enjoy it. But if it's going to hurt you, then I think it's worthwhile to kind of take a step back and be like, I'm the greatest I'll ever be at this. It's not really benefiting me to remain here. Then it's arguable that that energy could be used elsewhere, right? So as with most of the things we talk about on this show, there's no clear answer. There's no, it's time to walk away from that, right? And there are some things, like if you're in an abusive relationship, get the heck out of that, right? Yeah. But for most other things, it's very much a sliding scale. I think one of the things that's kind of popping in my mind here, and maybe you can help me figure it out, is that there are many of these things that we talk about that are very much tied up in our own self-worth, right? Like you think about the athlete, they very much define themselves, who they are as people, because they're an athlete, right? If you think about a bad relationship, think about how many times you hear somebody say, I lost myself in that relationship for that other person. And I think maybe that's the crux of the situation here, is that when you are in something and you find that your entire self-worth is tied up in that thing, that's maybe when you should start looking at walking away. Because if you are that tied up in it, then there's going to be other sacrifices in your life that you're making to remain so invested in that. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. I think that it speaks to our fear of the unknown, right? And again, whether it's a relationship or a job and like for context, I guess the thing that I'm really struggling with is like my work as a dance fitness instructor. I love it. I'm real freaking good at it. But I also know that like the extent to which I can engage groups of kids or adults or whatever the style of the class I'm teaching is in that way is very much dependent on my physical capacity, which like I recognize is like I've definitely passed my peak in terms of like my abilities in dance playing. Not because I'm any less good at it, but just like my physical capacity to do it isn't as good. And so I think about but it's such a comfort zone for me. It's something that I know, it's something that I love. And to your point, I recognize, and I think it's easy for us in our brains to understand that like, if I leave something, then it provides space for me to grow into something new. But that's a really hard thing for the heart to wrap itself around. And so, I think that it certainly makes it a big challenge, which speaks to what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. So let's try and look at this a little bit more pros and cons-y. Sunk costs. Explain those to me.
Yeah. So I guess this is kind of like one of the things that I think gets in the way of people letting go is this idea of, sunk costs. For those of you who aren't familiar, again, the business nerding on people with some of these terms. I did SWOT analysis in the last one and sunk costs in this episode. Sunk cost is the idea that we justify investing more money to try to turn around an investment that has proven to be poor. And we're trying to basically buy our way out of a bad investment. It doesn't have to be money. Think of it as time.
Yeah, sure.
So I guess this is the other side of where I'm kind of interested in when to let go, because and either way, our egos are very wrapped up in when we choose to let go of something. And I think that the example of being at the peak of your success and mastery in a thing and when to let go of that is one example. But I think the other example is like, when do we let go of something that really just like hasn't quite got off the ground in the same way? And I think entrepreneurs probably face this a lot. So I'm curious for your take from that perspective. But like, there comes a point in time where you have to recognize that an endeavor maybe isn't achieving what you thought it would achieve. And at what point do you let that go? And at what point do you kind of like recognize or take the shot to the ego or whatever it is that this thing isn't going to produce what we thought it was going to, and therefore we need to step away instead of like continuing to like hammer at it and chase at it and persevere and try to get to that place. So I guess like, yeah, these are kind of the two buckets that I'm kind of thinking about this in. And so from the entrepreneurial standpoint, like, how do you think about an endeavor that just hasn't succeeded and how it's time to walk away from that?
I think about it in a time perspective. And what I mean by that is, what is the time investment that I am putting into this, and is the outcome from it applicable and in respective of that time? So you can if you think about it with an entrepreneurial idea, if you have a business that isn't really making you money, okay, but you're investing very little time in it, then the argument can be made, if I just tried harder, I gave it more time, right? I worked harder at this, it would turn around and make me more money. Then you can say, let's continue going. I'm going to actually commit to this. I'm going to actually give it a go, and I'm going to make this work, right? But if you are investing time and money and energy into a business and you're not making any of that in return, then you have to actively say that this is just not a good business plan. This isn't working out for me, right? So either something needs to change or I need to move on.
So how can we separate those things? Because there's a few things that you're saying, like, this is not a good business plan. This is not working for me. Like, how do you detach your ego from these things? Because I think that is a really, I think that what you said before is a really common mindset that a lot of people have, whether it's a business or whatever sort of venture. Like, if I just work harder, this will turn around. But I think that the reality of a lot of situations is there's so many environmental things that go on that like our perseverance is not the sole metric of whether or not something's successful. So how do you detach our ego from a sense? I get the other things, like I get the money, I get the time, I get all of that. But like, how do we actually detach our egos from this conversation to actually come up with an objective understanding that like, you know, you talk about kind of bringing athletes into this example. There are kids everywhere that just like want to be the next great NBA player, but they're not tall enough, not fast enough. And so they can watch all the film. They can practice for 24 hours a day. It doesn't matter. They're just not there because there are other environmental things that trump hard work. So like, how do we detach our egos from this conversation in a way that is really, really meaningful to understand, like, not only is it a time investment, but like, it's not always just a factor of the hard work that we're putting into it. Because like, no matter how much hard work I put in, I'm not going to be an NFL player.
Well, that's just an aspect of realism. Like, how do you detach your ego from anything in this world, right? Any sort of good mentor in business, part of that mentorship is for them to sit down with you and look at things in, a quantifiable way. Money, time, energy, emotional cost, family cost, right? All those kinds of things. And, if you think about it in the athlete perspective, a coach will be like, hey, Matt, I'm sorry, but you aren't large enough to, be a lineman in the NFL. So there's no point in you even trying. Sure, that may hurt your ego, but it's a fact. It's a reality, right? I think what a lot of people struggle with when we talk about this idea of moving on from something is, like you said, they find a fault within themselves that they believe is fixable, whether it, working harder or spending more time or something like that. But if you're working on a business and you look at that business and you go, well, this product isn't selling, there's a problem with the product. It doesn't matter how many more hours you spend trying to push that product, it's not selling. Yeah. Right? So the only way I can think of to detach your ego from it is to look at it in a very quantifiable way with everything. List the pros and cons, have the proper idea of what is going on, and then you can almost step back and say, I have done everything I am capable of to make this work, and it's not working. Time to move on. So again, is the reason you're not leaving this thing behind because of something that you can control or something that you can't control?
That's a really important distinction, I think. I think that's really good.
Right? If you can control it and you feel the investment of whatever you're giving is worth it, go ahead. But if you can't control it, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much money and time you throw at it, you cannot control it. That's when you have to actively look at walking away. Right? Because the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Right? Albert Einstein. So can you control it? And so we look at that as an athlete. An athlete gets injured, right? Needs a knee replacement. Can't control that. Could he work his butt off and do a whole bunch of rehab and this and that? Yeah, probably. Will he ever play at his full capacity again? Likely not, right? You look at it in terms of business, right? If this product legally can't be sold in my country, no matter how hard I work at that business, I can't sell that product. Right? You look at it in terms of a relationship. We've been together for this long. We go to couples therapy. We're still having nothing but arguments. Oh, I can't control the way this other person acts. Time to look at moving on. And again, it seems really cold and detached and clinical, but sometimes that's the only way to remove your ego, remove your feelings from something that you are invested in, is to look at it in a detached and clinical way.
Yeah.
Right?
So then, and this is kind of similar, I guess, or the next step from the ego detachment. Talk to me about legacy. Again, as I'm kind of thinking about when will be the right time for me to move on from teaching the dance fitness program that I teach. I think there's there's probably more. I'm thinking of two different ways that you can argue for this idea of legacy. Is the legacy being remembered for your peak, or is your legacy the summation of all the things? And I guess it seems easy to argue, well, your legacy is the sum of the impact that you've had doing the thing. But I worry that, it's kind of this formula where it's like the sum of the impact minus whatever deterioration from the peak to the end. Like, I don't know, my brain wants to do something like that. And I guess from a legacy standpoint, again, this is an ego conversation because it's important to me that when I move on from anything that it's like camping. You want to leave it cleaner than you found it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so how does legacy for you factor into a conversation about when to leave?
So the thing that's kind of coming to mind here is that I have always kind of had this personal belief for relationships. And that belief is that no matter what, I must leave you better than I found you. So the idea that kind of comes with that is we could have a loving relationship with all of the ups and downs, and then it ends in this glorious fight and we never talk to each other again. But when you think back on your time with me, are you able to say that you at least felt I treated you well? Right? That I was an encouragement to you, that I tried to help you through the hard times. No matter how it ended, no matter what, did I leave you better than I found you? So when you think about a legacy, whether it's something you created or something you helped build to a certain point or a skill set that you developed, are you leaving the people that you interacted with? Are you leaving the industry that you're now leaving? Are you leaving whatever is touched by that activity better than you found it? So if we were to focus in, if you don't mind, on your dance play, I think that you created this wonderful, and I know you didn't create it from scratch, but you helped build this wonderful idea of what dance play is, right? So when the time comes for you to move away from that, you can take a step back and say, well, I took it from here to here, and it is better than when I got it. And that is what is remembered. That is what the legacy is. It's not, oh, we had 3 or 4 great years and then that last 2 years kind of sucked, or it was less than. Nobody's going to remember those less than years. What they're going to remember is this is where we started, this is where we ended when he left. Right? So when I think about legacy, it's purely, did you leave it better than you found it? Right? And no matter what happened in between, at the end, whatever, as long as the overall scope is that you left it better than you found it, then I think that's a pretty amazing legacy to leave behind. Because when you think on the grand term of almost anything, it is the summation, going back to your original, it is the summation of many people's interactions with something that can make something truly great, right? There is no singular company that was built by just one person and went from nothing to $1 billion company, right? It may have started with one person in his garage, but it took the summation of everybody else through that entire period to make this an amazing organization, right? And when that one person eventually leaves, they're going to know, look where he started, look where he ended. We're going to carry on the torch, right? You look at it as a relationship, the culmination of all of these people that dated this person until they eventually got married. Well, you need all of the crappy relationships before you find your person so that you know how to treat that person the way they deserve to be treated. Right? It is the summation of everything.
I like that. I think that's a good way of looking at it, I guess. And we're talking about a couple of different things, and I think right now I'm having a hard time kind of separating the two, but I think we're talking about a couple of different things of like moving on individually and then moving on in terms of like the thing not existing anymore. And I guess I'm having a hard time trying to reconcile the two. One of the things that I've been struggling with, and I'm not the only dance play instructor in Calgary, but I've certainly been like one of the primary ones for a long time. I'm worried about the gap that I might leave. And so I'm thinking in this moment of like how much a legacy is tied up in the fact that to this point that and I don't think this is on me. This has never really been my role in the company, but like I'm worried that the legacy will be impacted by the fact that I've got nobody kind of coming up to step in and fill the gap that I'm leaving, if and when I leave.
I think maybe you're looking at that gap as a bad thing, and it maybe isn't. So when you think about the opportunity for something to grow and improve, that normally happens because there is a reason for it to happen, right? Like nobody changes and improves themselves without some sort of outside stimulus helping them or forcing them to do it, right? So if you leave this gap and the program suffers, it's going to force the organization to find a solution for that problem. And that might mean hiring another dance play instructor. It might mean having someone from, the original creators step back in to fill the gap. Maybe it means that they develop a really cool internal training program to make sure this never happens again. It gives that organization an opportunity for growth. If you've ever been dumped real hard, what do most people do when they've been dumped and they're kind of crushed about it? They hit the gym. They start taking up hobbies. They improve. But if that heartbreak had never happened, they would have not received that stimulus. So you can be concerned about the well-being of something that you're leaving behind, for sure. But I don't think that's a reason for you not to leave it behind. Because at the end of the day, you got to do what's right for you. And you got to look at it as this is hopefully an opportunity for that thing I'm leaving behind to improve further.
I'm doing some like really, this is really great for my reflection. I guess I was always coached or mentored on the idea that like I will be ready for my next opportunity when I have filled my own gap. Like when I've basically this idea that like I'll be ready for a promotion when I have mentored somebody well enough that they could step in and be successful in the role that I'm currently in. But you're now like, this is the second conversation that I've had that's challenged that bias that I don't necessarily need to replace myself prior. Like that doesn't need to be a prerequisite to change. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that is going to take me some more time to like continue to reflect on and grasp at. And I think that, I guess for me, and this has often been true when I've had to let go of things, it is less for me about being nervous about what's on the other side and more like worried about the gap that I'm leaving behind.
Sure.
And I don't know that I've been able to articulate that well until now.
You can be worried about it all you want, but it isn't a reason to hold yourself back. Right? And you've got it in our show notes here, leaving comfort zones and stepping into the unknown of the next thing. So you're not afraid of stepping into the unknown. But I think what you need to acknowledge is that by stepping into that unknown, you are giving everybody involved an opportunity to improve. Yourself, what you're leaving behind, the next person, etc. Right? Think about how many times you think about in like a corporate environment where somebody quits and the person underneath them is expected to step into that role and help fill it. Well, that person is going to be given the opportunity to grow into that role now. But if the person had never left, it would have never happened. Right? So I can totally understand why you're kind of struggling with this. And like anybody that's thinking about leaving something behind, think of, again, going back to a relationship. You don't want to hurt that person that you care about. So you don't want to leave them. Right?
Yeah.
But again, if you shift the thinking of, I'm going to leave this person for whatever reasons there are, instead of thinking about how that's going to hurt them, you could think about how this is going to give them an opportunity to grow. Right? So I do find it interesting that you're more concerned about, the thing you're leaving behind than you are yourself. Right? And that's just a sign of empathy, which is wonderful. But at the same time, right, you got to keep moving. You got to keep growing. We talk about it on this show all the time, growth, improvement, skills, this, that, right? Sometimes you're stuck and you can't do any more where you're at. And you need to reclaim some of that energy from a place that isn't serving you as much anymore, right? And that should be your primary focus, is what is right for me. Right? And I think another thing that people really struggle with when it comes time to looking at leaving things behind is this concept of, what if I make the wrong choice? Right? What if I end this relationship and it turns out that person was the love of my life? If you ended the relationship, they weren't the love of your life. Well, what happens if I quit this job and then, the new job doesn't work out? Then you go get another new job. Right? Like, life, we are but the summation of our experiences. So you'd be a pretty boring person if you had no experiences. So go and have them. Don't worry about making the wrong choice. Are you going to feel anxious about it and sick about it? And am I right? Am I wrong? Yeah, you're allowed to feel all of that, but you have to know at the end of the day, almost everything works out. And you will be a better, more well-rounded person because you took that leap, because you tried that out, whether it works out or not. Right? Leaving something behind is so immensely difficult for so many different reasons. But I think there's so many things on an emotional level as human beings we get stuck in. And there's an immense amount of freedom in just being able to say, screw it, let's just try and see what happens. Right? And I wish that I could take my own advice on this because it is so hard. But I think that a lot of the things that you're talking about here are a very natural reaction, but you almost kind of have to hit the just fuck it button sometimes and give it a try. Right? Excuse my language.
Yeah, I think thank you. This has been a really nice on mic therapy session. I think that this is really, really, really good. I mean, I think that we've kind of diverted a little bit from our typical framework, but I think in all this conversation, we've really touched on what it means as millennials to go through this. I think we've touched on certainly the community impact and the gaps that are left behind and the opportunities available for communities to heal and grow. And what I'm really kind of taking away right now is maybe there's, as you say, opportunities for the environment to grow more without me in it, and the things that I can't control from the inside. So I'm really taking that well.
Good.
In terms of like next steps. I mean, I hear you. I think pros and cons is a really, like, when we look at making actions count, the pros and cons are super important. And I think that, I'm always a huge proponent of writing things down, physically writing it down. I think that helps to just make lists more real. I also, a lot of what you've been saying has had me thinking about the imagery of trimming a tree, right? It's not that we are
not cutting it down.
Right. We're not cutting down trees. We're simply trimming branches to make room for new growth. And I think that that's an important thing that we need to remember. I think that it's also important to assess why we do a thing. And I think that you're making me think a lot about the idea that in terms of like my future in and around dance play, I mean, I've had similar conversations with the creator of dance play. So even Mel, if you're listening, this isn't something new. And I've told her in so many words that like I will always be involved in some way, in some capacity, regardless of what that looks like. But I think this is giving me the encouragement to know that I am doing this for me, and I don't necessarily need to do this for dance play anymore, that I can do this for me, which is like a really empowering thought. So I think in saying that, it's important. I'm trying to prescribe actions to everybody while trying to do them myself at the same time. I think it's really important to assess why we're doing the thing that we're doing. If we're considering letting go, if we think we need to transition or move away, I think we need to assess why we do that thing. Is it the same reason why we started doing it? Does that why hold true? And are there things that we could be doing that are in better service of that why? Whether it's the individual balance of what you're doing, or kind of your more broad global purpose that you like to pursue in your life. I think, and this is again something that I'm obviously struggling with, it's important to really separate our worth as a person versus the value that we're bringing to society. We've had a lot of conversations in previous iterations, especially when this was the Men in Community podcast. We talked a lot about how we tend to like think about our value as an extension of what we are able to provide to others. And I think that becomes a challenging thing to articulate, but it's important to be able to split those two things apart. And even through most of this episode, you heard me talking about how I was really combining and conflating those things. And I think one of the things that has helped me the most when transitioning in my life out of certain things or into other things is we can only make decisions based on what we know right now in this moment. And we cannot be held responsible for knowing something different tomorrow than we do today. And so regretting decisions that we made based on the best information that we had available to us in that moment is never something that we can be faulted for. And we need to take comfort in that and not be afraid to take action in that, and just remember that we might know something different than we know today, and then that'll afford us the opportunity to make better decisions then. But it doesn't mean that we should absolve ourselves of making action today.
No.
What would you add to that list?
I think this is an immensely personal thing. And I think that kind of what I want to do here is talk a little bit more broadly in like a philosophical sense. And this may sound super weird and like whimsical, but I think it's something that I truly believe in. I believe that millennials are a defining generation, that we are an anchor being. If you've seen Deadpool and Wolverine, okay, we have something very crucial coming up in the next, 50 years that is going to involve some really strong leadership. It's going to involve some really altering ideas. It's going to require the collective understanding that we as a generation have brought forth that I think is truly unique. But the reality of all of that, and you can kind of look at the world and you can see what I'm talking about, like corporate greed, late stage capitalism, housing crises, affordability crises, groups like LGBTQ, the challenges that we're having with tolerance and acceptance. And there's so many things going on in this world right now, wars. there is something big coming, and it is going to require a very unique perspective, and it is going to require very strong people. And we as a generation cannot become those people if we do not open ourselves up for improvement and challenge and new ideas and new opportunity and leaving old things behind. Okay? The generation before us is stuck in their ways. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but they're not moving with the times, and it is hurting the rest of us. And we as a generation seem to acknowledge this, but we have to be the best versions of ourselves to be able to improve what is going to be moving forward. So I think when we think about these ideas of making these big changes and walking away from things and being good people and doing everything that we can, we have to almost think about it a little bit more globally. Right? Yes, you got to do what is right for you. But at the same time, by you growing and you becoming better, you will help those around you. You will make your community better. And if you're someone that listens to this show because you believe and you enjoy what the things that me and Matt talk about and the perspectives that we bring, it's probably because you feel that you also could make the people around you better, and you can make the communities that you're a part of better. But that requires you to grow. And you can't be afraid of that, no matter how scary the process of leaving or trying something new could be.
If I was to summarize what you just shared, which I think is super, super powerful, and I know that I'm going to be pausing and rewinding that multiple times. There's a couple of things that are really coalescing for me. The first one is, I think you're absolutely right. I think with all the things that are happening in the world, that there's going to be more change that happens rather than less. I think that is absolutely inevitable, and it's inevitable because the alternative is worse.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really powerful statement that we need to really consciously get ready for a time where change is going to happen fast, and that we need to be prepared to be adaptive. And so that means that we're going to have to let go of things quicker and more readily than maybe we ever have to make space for whatever these new systems that are inevitably going to come into place. So I totally agree with that. It also reminds me of something that your dad said when we had him on in our dad's episode. And he said, there's always been terrible things going on in the world. Don't let that stop you. Don't let that stop you from starting a family, starting a business. Just don't let it stop you. And I think when we've talked about this idea of being stuck, but in order for us to say that we're moving on from something, we also have to be prepared to say yes to the things that came before or will come next. And so we have to be prepared to say yes, because we can't move on from something that we haven't said yes to. And so I think this being ready for change mindset that we have to adopt has to go both ways. We have to be ready and prepared to let go, but we also have to be ready and prepared to say yes and accept those things as they come. And I think those are really, really powerful pieces that, as happens so often in our episodes, this is not where I thought we'd be going, but I think it's such a important thing, whether it's a relationship move, career move, or whatever it is. Maybe it's a physical moving to a different place entirely. We maybe need to take more opportunities, to say yes to opportunities in order to be able to move on from opportunities, to practice being comfortable in this change that is inevitable.
To me, it's so exciting to think about what is coming for myself, not only personally, but for the communities and the people around us, because there's so much opportunity for good, right? I'm not saying I'm an expert in history or economics or, any of that, but just the feeling I have is that we could diverge down two paths as people and as a society, and one path is good and the other is bad. full, like unobjectively, one is good and one is bad. And I am excited for the good one, and I will do everything in my power to get us there, to get myself there. So you're right. This feels like a little bit of a divergence from almost any other kind of episode that we've had, because, it lost all structure and it stumbled a little bit. But I think that what we're talking about here, a lot of people are going to be able to kind of empathize with and feel for. And I hope that I'm not just spewing crazy conspiracy theories here, and that it makes sense, and that there's almost this higher calling that everybody feels about becoming the best versions of themselves, not only for themselves, but for everybody around them.
Love that. I think in closing, I want to start us off with gratitude and just say thank you. Thank you for helping me navigate this idea. And it actually, I think there was room for this to become a lot more scary as we start talking about like global systems change and but it actually is more reassuring to me. It's reassuring in the sense that like just the reminder that change is inevitable, the reminder that whatever decision will be the right decision because I'm the one doing it, right? I have this quote that I need to remind myself more often that's hanging up in my office that says, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, I know the next chapter is going to be amazing because I trust the author. And I need to remember that and live into that, lean into that more. So thank you. I appreciate you for reminding me of that and taking me on that journey today.
You're welcome. Anytime. Just giving a smack around the head. My gratitude today is to thank you for your vulnerability. You thank me for that all the time during our episodes. And I'm not saying that it's rare from you, but to have you very openly talk about this thing that you're struggling with and letting me not only try and guide you through it, but also to try and talk the big picture to you. That's not a conversation that you can have with many people. People get very defensive over those kinds of things. So I want to thank you for being vulnerable. I want to thank you for, giving me the opportunity to talk you through this, because it's a role I don't take lightly, and I will always be here to kind of guide you and be a voice for you whenever you need it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, everyone, this has been yet another episode of the Millennials and Community Podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us as always, regardless of whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on your favorite podcast platform. We appreciate you. We appreciate your support, and we're so glad to be on this journey with you. As always, you know where to find us on all of our social media platforms, and we can't wait to keep this conversation going. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.